Everything you depend on is more fragile than you think. The city you live in, the supply chains that stock your grocery store, the electrical grid that keeps the lights on, the agricultural systems that feed 8 billion people. All of it rests on a set of assumptions about the stability of the world that have held, more or less, for the last 10,000 years. But they have not always held. There have been moments in human history when the assumptions collapsed entirely, when the thing that was supposed to be permanent turned out not to be, when societies that had been building, accumulating, specializing, and growing for centuries simply stopped. Not declined, stopped. The Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BC brought down nearly every advanced civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean simultaneously. The cities of the Mycenaean Greeks, the Hittite Empire, Ugarit, dozens of trading cities across the Levant, all gone within roughly 50 years. Modern archaeologists still argue about what caused it. The survivors left almost no record of what they experienced. The eruption of Toba, roughly 74,000 years ago, was so catastrophic that it may have reduced the entire human population on Earth to somewhere between 1,000 and 10,000 individuals. Not 1,000 per region, 1,000 total. Our species came within reach of a threshold from which there may have been no return. And yet, we are here. Every single one of us is descended from people who survived things that should not have been survivable. The question that drives archaeologists, geneticists, and evolutionary biologists is not just what happened, it is how. How did ancient humans, without the technology or infrastructure that we rely on, survive events that erased everything they had built? The answers are more human than you might expect. In April of 1815, a volcano called Tambora on the island of Sumbawa in Indonesia erupted with a force that dwarfed anything recorded in modern history. The eruption column reached 40 kilometers into the stratosphere. The ash and sulfur dioxide ejected into the upper atmosphere spread across the entire planet, reflecting sunlight back into space. The following year, 1816, became known in Europe and North America as the year without a summer. Crop failures across the northern hemisphere, famine, livestock deaths, food riots. Tens of thousands of people died directly from starvation and the disease that follows it. Tambora was, by modern standards, not even the largest volcanic event of the Holocene. The Toba supervolcano eruption 74,000 years ago dwarfs Tambora by a factor of approximately 100. The ejected material blocked sunlight globally for years. Temperatures dropped, vegetation died on a continental scale. The food chains that early humans depended on collapsed across Africa and much of Asia simultaneously. Genetic evidence tells the story of what happened next. Modern humans carry remarkably little genetic diversity compared to other great apes, far less than you would expect from a species of 8 billion. This is the signature of a population bottleneck, a period when the total breeding population was so small that almost all subsequent human diversity derives from a tiny pool of survivors. The most widely accepted estimate puts the post-Toba human population at somewhere between 1,000 and 10,000 individuals. Some researchers argue it may have been even smaller. Those survivors did not have stored food reserves or emergency infrastructure. They had whatever their immediate group could carry. What kept them alive, researchers now believe, was a combination of three things: the specific geography of certain refugia in Africa, where volcanic winter had a less catastrophic effect, behavioral flexibility that allowed them to shift food sources rapidly when primary sources failed, and the social structure of their groups, specifically the ability to share resources within and between bands in ways that smoothed out the worst shocks of scarcity. The humans who survived Toba were not the strongest or the most individually resourceful. They were the most cooperative. Around 1200 BC, something happened in the Eastern Mediterranean that archaeologists have been trying to explain ever since. Within approximately 50 years, almost every advanced Bronze Age civilization in the region collapsed. The Mycenaean Greeks, gone. Their palace complexes burned, their writing system lost, their trade networks severed. Greece entered a dark age that would last roughly 400 years. The Hittite Empire, which had been a major power for centuries and fought Egypt to a standstill at Kadesh, gone. Ugarit, one of the great trading cities of the ancient world, destroyed and never rebuilt. Cyprus, the Levantine coast, the Aegean Islands, one after another, the cities that had formed an interconnected Bronze Age world, went dark. The last recorded correspondence from Ugarit is a letter asking urgently for grain and military assistance. It was never answered. The tablets were found still in the kiln where they were being fired when the city was destroyed. What caused it? The honest answer is that we do not fully know, and that uncertainty is itself revealing. The theories are multiple. A drought lasting decades, documented in pollen records and dead tree rings across the region. Internal rebellions driven by economic stress, migrations of groups the Egyptians called the Sea Peoples, documented in Egyptian records as attacking and displacing populations across the Mediterranean coast, and possibly an earthquake sequence that destabilized key cities at a vulnerable moment. Most researchers now believe it was not a single cause, but a convergence, multiple stresses arriving simultaneously on a system that was highly integrated and therefore highly brittle. The very interconnectedness that had made Bronze Age civilization prosperous made it vulnerable. When multiple nodes in the network failed at once, the whole network failed with them. But some people survived. In the margins of the collapsed world, in Cyprus, in certain parts of Greece, in the eastern Mediterranean, communities continued. They were smaller, less specialized, less connected. They had lost most of what their civilization had built. And from those remnants, eventually, something new grew. Looking across the evidence of human survival through catastrophic events, volcanic winters, civilizational collapse, floods, prolonged droughts, a pattern emerges in what the survivors had in common. It is not what most people would guess. It is not superior technology. The survivors of Toba had stone tools that were not meaningfully different from those of populations that did not survive. It is not military strength. The populations that made it through the Bronze Age collapse were not the most powerful ones. Those were often the ones that fell first. The consistent factors are smaller and more fundamental. Mobility. The populations with the most flexibility about where they were, who had not overcommitted to fixed infrastructure in a specific location, could move when conditions deteriorated. This is counterintuitive because we tend to think of settlement and infrastructure as achievements, and they are, but they are also liabilities when the conditions that made that specific location viable suddenly change. Dietary breadth. Populations that depended heavily on a single food source, one primary crop, one primary game animal, were catastrophically vulnerable when that source failed. Populations with broader, more flexible diets had more options when individual sources collapsed. Social redundancy. This is perhaps the most important and least obvious factor. Communities with multiple overlapping social networks, kinship systems, trade relationships, alliances with distant groups had more options when local resources failed. They could ask for help. They could move in with relatives. They could access the stored resources of another group that had been less badly affected. The researchers who study famine and collapse consistently find that the deadliest disasters are not simply the ones with the most absolute destruction. They are the ones that simultaneously destroy the social networks that would otherwise enable mutual support. When a catastrophe isolates people from each other at the same time it destroys their resources, the death toll is far higher than when equivalent destruction leaves social networks intact. Ancient humans survived catastrophe not because any individual was remarkably resilient. They survived because their groups were remarkably connected. There's a specific kind of knowledge that archaeologists sometimes call embedded flexibility. It refers to the way that pre-agricultural and early agricultural societies maintained within their cultural knowledge base the information needed to survive at a lower level of complexity than their current one. Hunter-gatherer techniques preserved within farming communities. Secondary food sources known, but not used under normal conditions. Routes and relationships with distant groups maintained even when not economically necessary against a future moment when they might be. It is the cognitive equivalent of a backup system. Not needed most of the time, essential when everything else fails. Modern societies have largely lost this. We have optimized for efficiency at the cost of redundancy. We know, intellectually, that the supply chains we depend on are extraordinarily complex and fragile. We know that most urban populations have no realistic access to food independent of those supply chains. We know that the systems we have built are more interconnected than any system in human history, and that the Bronze Age collapse demonstrated exactly what interconnection does to vulnerability. And yet, we continue to build them, because under normal conditions they work extraordinarily well. The same calculation that ancient Bronze Age merchants were making when they built an integrated Mediterranean trading network. It worked, until it didn't. The ancient humans who survived Toba, who endured the Bronze Age collapse, who made it through volcanic winters and prolonged droughts, were not hoping that the catastrophe would be as bad as it looked. They were doing the thing that the long history of human survival suggests is the only thing that actually works. They stayed connected to each other. They kept their options open. They remembered how to live at a simpler level than the one they normally occupied. They survived not because they were exceptional, but because they had never fully forgotten how not to depend on what they had built.